Module 15, the urinary system. Urine formation, step 1, glomerular filtration. In the last section, I went over the 4 steps to how blood is cleaned in the kidneys. We will now take a closer look at each step. The first step is the filtration of the blood. This step happens in the glomerulus, so the official name for this process is glomerular filtration. This is a closer look at the renal corpuscle. It's made up of the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. The capillaries of the glomerulus have pores. They are called fenestrae. Fenestrae make these capillaries more porous than the rest of the capillaries in the body. And this is a good thing, because so much of the material of the blood has to pass through them. In fact, about 20% of the total plasma moving through the capillaries leaves them and enters the Bowman's capsule each minute. Now, the Bowman's capsule is composed of 2 layers. The parietal layer is the outer layer, made up of simple squamous epithelium. The inside layer is called the visceral layer. This layer is porous. The cells in the visceral layer are called podocytes. They are specialized cells that attach to the glomerular capillaries via tiny processes called foot processes. In order for the filtrate to leave the capillaries, it has to move through the filtration membrane. This membrane is made up of the porous wall of the glomerular capillaries, the basement membrane of the glomerular capillaries, and the podocytes. Because the capillaries are filled with fenestrae, they have to be held together. This is done by the podocytes. Podocytes behave as a structural mesh or netting that behaves as a filter and also holds material together. The filtration membrane is there to keep the proteins from moving out of the capillaries. Remember that proteins are very large molecules. They are too big to pass through the fenestrae. Now, actually, a few proteins are able to make it through, but they're brought back into the bloodstream by pinocytosis. But as a whole, we can say the filtrate which makes it into the Bowman's capsule is made up of blood plasma minus the blood cells and plasma proteins. From this point, the filtrate moves out of the Bowman's capsule and into the proximal tubule. And this happens rather quickly. In fact, the rate is called the glomerular filtration rate. It's the rate at which filtrate is produced in glomerular filtration, which is 125 milliliters per minute. That means the kidneys filter about 180 liters of filtrate each day. Or you can say that all the plasma in the blood is filtered an average of every 25 minutes. This speed is due first to the extreme permeability of the filtration membrane. Additionally, the pressure of the blood inside the capillaries is pretty high. In fact, it's higher than the blood pressure within the other capillaries of the body. Ordinary capillaries have a blood pressure of about 25 millimeters of mercury. But glomerular capillaries have a blood pressure of about twice that, or 50 millimeters of mercury. Thus, plasma is easily pushed out of the glomerular capillaries and through the filtration membrane. Why is the pressure higher here? Well, it's due to the structure of the arterioles that enter and leave the glomerulus. The afferent arteriole, which brings blood to the glomerulus, is here, and the efferent arteriole, which brings blood out of the glomerulus, is here. The blood in the efferent arteriole has less plasma in it because a lot of that plasma became filtrate in the nephron. So the plasma-poor blood in the efferent arteriole moves to more capillaries along the length of the nephron so it can reabsorb molecules that the nephron sends it. The efferent arteriole is much narrower than the afferent arteriole. This doesn't allow as much blood to flow into it, so it begins to back up within the glomerulus, causing a higher pressure. It's kind of like if you had a flexible garden hose, and as water was flowing through that hose, you stepped on it a bit. You just prevented a lot of water from flowing through the hose at that point, so the water begins to back up, and the pressure in the hose coming before your foot becomes greater. If you suddenly take your foot off the hose, the water will spew out of the hose end faster as that greater pressure was released. Thus, we can say that the blood pressure in the glomerulus, or the glomerular capillary pressure, is higher because the efferent arteriole is smaller in diameter than the afferent arteriole. This excess pressure causes the glomerular filtration rate to be high. Now, if blood pressure decreases, then the glomerular filtration rate will decrease too. And if the glomerular capillary pressure rate increases, then the glomerular filtration rate will increase. You probably can understand then that a person's overall blood pressure will affect the glomerular capillary pressure. If a person suffers from low blood pressure, the glomerular capillary pressure will decrease, which will also decrease the glomerular filtration rate. Conversely, if a person has high blood pressure, then the glomerular capillary pressure will increase, and the glomerular filtration rate will too. The pressure within the glomerular capillaries is very important. If it were to get too low, the glomerular filtration rate could slow down until it didn't occur at all. This would result in renal shutdown, which is a lack of production of urine. How could this happen? Well, there are two opposing pressures to the glomerular capillary pressure. The first is due to the Bowman's capsule pushing back against the glomerulus. That's called the capsular pressure. To better understand this, let's go back to our hose example. Let's say you have a hose with a leak in it. You stop up that leak by wrapping the hose in duct tape. Now, if you've ever done that, you know that the tape will not completely stop the water from leaking out of the hose. It does help, but not completely. It's helpful because the duct tape exerts pressure against the water flow out of the hole, and that decreases the amount of water coming out of it. Well, the parietal layer of the Bowman's capsule is like the duct tape. It exerts pressure against the filtrate that's moving out of the capillaries. In fact, we know it exerts 10 millimeters of mercury of pressure against the glomerular capillary pressure. The second situation of pressure against the glomerular capillary pressure has to do with osmosis. I already mentioned how the filtrate is the material that leaves the capillaries, but the proteins remain inside. Thus, the concentration of proteins in the blood inside the glomerulus is higher than the concentration of proteins in the blood material outside the glomerulus. Because the proteins cannot move through the filtration membrane, water will want to fix this situation. So the water in the filtrate is attracted back to the location of the higher concentration of proteins. That means it will cross the filtration membrane and move back into the capillaries. But that movement opposes the glomerular capillary pressure, which is pushing water out of the capillaries. We call the pressure that this osmosis provides the colloid osmotic pressure. It's about 30 millimeters of mercury. The capsular pressure and the colloid osmotic pressure create a total of 40 millimeters of mercury of pressure, working against the glomerular capillary pressure. Earlier, I mentioned that the glomerular capillary pressure is about 50 millimeters of mercury, so it is higher than the other two, and it results in plasma moving out of the capillaries and into the Bowman's capsule of the nephron. But if a person becomes severely ill or injured and has a significantly low blood pressure as a result, then the glomerular capillary pressure will decrease. And if it decreases by only 10 millimeters of mercury of pressure, then it will be equal to the factors that move against it. So no plasma will leak out of the capillaries and kidney filtration cannot happen. This is a serious situation. Your body can only survive for about 2 or 3 days without blood filtration. But thankfully, this is a rare situation. It requires a major hemorrhage or massive dehydration for something like this to happen.